We think of a library and we think of books. A library has books on the shelves. I don't think of books when I go to the library. As a scientist, I know that in the library, there are these, the scientific journals. And this is actually the main thing about the library. It's a place where you can go to the direct, original source of information. They might look like little pamphlets or strange little things, but this is actually where scientists publish their main information. We produce scientific papers, which are then collected into volumes, and it's the volumes that, well, the issues, the monthly issues that you can see here on the shelves. And then at the end of each year, those monthly issues are physically put together in a volume, in a kind of book, and it's those volumes that then go onto the shelves, usually hidden away in an underground part of the library or somewhere, but this is the main scientific literature. And in a way, it's the main treasure that you can find buried in the library. So I'm going to put particular emphasis on scientific journals for several reasons. One of those is the concept of peer review. Okay, what's a peer? A peer is somebody at your level. Okay, so I'm a research scientist and my peers are other research scientists, but in particular, I study ecology and plant physiology, so my peers are research scientists that study plant ecology and physiology. So the idea is that these journals can communicate knowledge, okay? They communicate in a very concise and specific way between peers. So you're communicating directly with the people that need the knowledge, but it's also a kind of quality control. When, for example, somebody publishes a scientific paper, I have several examples here which I've printed off. When somebody publishes a scientific paper, it's checked first by an editor, who is usually somebody with some experience in that subject, and then he sends it out to 2 or 3, maybe even 4 other peers who check it. They note any flaws in the method. They check that it's actually realistic, that there are no lies, or and that it's done correctly, and that it's explained correctly and written in a way that communicates the message. So it really is the best kind of quality technical document that you can find. The other importance, the particular importance about peer-reviewed scientific journals and documents is that they also serve as indicators of scientific progress. For example, my own personal production as a scientist. Okay, if I worked in a factory, I'd be producing tires, and you can imagine that my production is measured in the number of tires that I produce. This is also used to look at my production as a scientist. I've been involved in 10, 15 studies, okay, and I've produced 20 scientific articles. This is a high production, and these things are actually important because the university can use that to show that the funding that it gets is being translated into science, and it helps to get more funding. It helps the university to become prestigious, and it also helps the individual scientist. Okay, so it's very, very important for people's careers as well, aside from the importance of the science itself. So understanding these documents is very important. But again, I repeat, I could be talking about any technical document. Even a master's thesis or a PhD thesis will have the same kind of basic structure. Maybe with a thesis, you have a bit more space and you can add more details, but the general kind of structure and type of formal language remains the same. So before I talk specifically about this, I'll just carry on showing you the actual scientific journals. Okay, maybe you've seen this kind of thing before. Have you looked at scientific journals on the internet? Sometimes, okay. No, I ask because when I started doing my doctorate, so many years ago, I can't remember, more than 20 years ago, before that, I hadn't read a scientific paper and I didn't understand how important they are. And when I went to the library, I looked at books. And it was only when my supervisor said, we go to the library together, ignore the books, let's look at this. And I really understood it, and I understood how fundamental it is to any document that we produce. Okay, so when you produce your thesis, this is absolutely fundamental. Nowadays, of course, it's not just in the library. We have journals that are published in the paper version and also online, and we have journals that are published only online. But this is an example, just one example of the main journal website in this particular case for the Journal of Agricultural Science. Okay, so what we're going to be doing first is looking at a paper from the Journal of Agricultural Science. So I've gone to a famous search engine, Google, and put in agriculture, scientific journals, and one of the journals that's come out is the Journal of Agricultural Science. So this is the main page. This is a statement of what the journal is about. So this main paragraph with the photograph of the journal itself is basically saying, in this journal, we are interested in X, Y, Z, in these particular subjects. Okay, so you know a bit about the journal. But then, of course, you can search within the journal. So if you want to search for, well, I'm a botanist, so I'm going to look for something to do with plants, but I'm also going to look for something that most people have in their lives, and that, of course, is coffee. I'm going to search for coffee production in the Journal of Agricultural Science. So I put coffee production, and what comes out is a list of papers with the titles, the authors, and how to get access. So it could be a file that I can download, or even a web page. The other thing that you can do is simply search issue by issue, opening each particular one at a time, and going in and seeing what there is. So I've searched for coffee. Some things have come out. In fact, the first one, it's a bit difficult to read, but it is actually about coffee production. So if we go to the page, we can see the title, the authors, the summary, and then how to download the actual document. Now, I have here in the lecture theatre some papers which are, well, one of them is actually the old style, where the journal itself has sent me. This isn't something that I've printed off myself. This was produced during the production of the actual printed version. So it's on really high quality paper. But when you download them from the internet, of course, they're PDF files. Okay, PDF. Undoubtedly, you've heard of PDFs, portable document format. The idea is that it's a standard format for documents that you can read on any device, okay. But the other way that scientific papers are communicated is in HTML, hypertext markup language. This is the main language of websites, okay, so as simple web pages. So these are basically the three formats in which we find scientific technical documents: portable document format, hypertext markup language, or in print in the library. So you go and search for the physical volume. What we have on the screen is the PDF version of this paper on coffee that I've downloaded. Controlled irrigation and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilization affect the biochemical composition and quality of Arabica coffee beans. Okay, fantastic. I have my document in my hands. How do I interpret this? I have to share another personal experience from when I did my doctorate, which was that the first time that I had a scientific paper in my hands, despite the fact that I'm a mother tongue, I speak English as my mother tongue. I'm actually born in England, okay? It's difficult. Okay, I spent a whole day just looking through it, and you realize that it's not just about the formal language. It's about several things. Firstly, it's one single message. The message in this case is about how to grow coffee. It's about how to grow coffee. Everything else that's in there is supporting that. It's providing extra information. The data that's in there is supporting the title, supporting the main message. Even the citations of other work are supporting the main message. Once you understand that, you realize that you can ignore most of it and just read bits of it and jump over most of it, understanding that it's there. For example, the citations, you don't need to read them. You have to learn how to read a sentence and jump over the citations. But if you need to go into more detail about one particular argument, one particular sentence, the information is there. So the first thing to say about scientific and technical documents is that they're actually quite simple on one level. It's one message with a lot of supporting things that you can ignore. Okay. The other thing is that once you understand the structure, it becomes a lot simpler. And a lot of the structure is based on the idea of paragraphs and divisions, which divide not the text, but the concepts. Why am I saying this in relation to English? Because one of the things that I was taught and one of the things that I understand when I read or write a technical document is that the paragraphs are little boxes where concepts are put with a bit of supporting information for that concept. But one of the things that I see when people start writing or they're trying to interpret for the first time a scientific document, and something that I see in Italian is that paragraphs and division and structure is not understood. Okay, even in professional scientists who are writing in Italian, when they write, each paragraph is a single sentence. So you have lots of separate sentences and then a huge block of text. And I think there's also a cultural element to this, particularly in Great Britain. We are taught to write, we're taught to structure a document, and we have hardly any oral examinations, and we're very bad at speaking and presenting things in public. Okay, so all of our efforts have gone into text and reading and understanding and writing text. Here in Italy, the cultural difference is that there's a lot of emphasis on kind of instantaneous thinking and knowing and expressing vocally, which is a different kind of skill. It's a very cool skill, okay, but it's a very different skill. And in science, there's a lot of emphasis on the other side of it, which is communicating in a written way. So I think that there is a cultural difference. So when I'm talking about English, I'm not just talking about vocabulary and grammar, but mainly about the concepts behind document structure. So what I've done on the next slide is to take the main structure of a paper. Firstly, we have to understand that there's the main document itself, okay, the main thing, but a correct formal scientific document has a lot of supporting information before and after, information about the identity of the document, information that allows you to find and use the document, okay, and at the end, there's a lot of extra material. The scientific documents are very concise and compact, but very often there are data sets and extra information that could be useful. So there's supporting information. So the first thing that we can do when we're reading a document is understand that we need to focus on the main text, okay? But then the main text itself is also divided. What I'm going to do over the next couple of slides is to explain the structure. I'll be starting by looking at article information, okay, but then we'll be focusing on the main text, how the text is structured, and then looking at the supporting information. But even here, there is a simple message. The structure, the logical structure, the conceptual structure is a very simple river that flows from a source to the sea. It starts from a problem and it ends up with an interpretation of the new science that you've done or that has been done in the paper. So one of the things that you'll see very often is that technical documents are divided into introduction, methods, results, and discussion. But again, it's a conceptual division. And the concepts that are communicated are basically the problem, what's being studied. The methods are what was done to look at this problem. The results were what was seen, okay, the data, the information that's come out of the study, and the discussion is an interpretation, what it means. Now, this might seem very obvious. It's clear that there needs to be a logical progression in any document, but you would be amazed at the number of times that I've seen data presented in the discussion, so graphs thrown into the discussion, interpretation presented with the results, and basically, if we don't respect this general structure, it creates confusion. If everyone understands how this document works as a mechanism, it can be understood much more easily. Okay, so what I'm going to be showing is how to interpret a document like this. And one of the things that we'll be looking at tomorrow is looking at how to write. And tomorrow I'll be talking more about the kind of formal language and how to express yourself in science. I'll just very briefly say that in general communication, we can communicate in facts, numbers. We can also communicate emotively, like that's really big, or I like that, or that's really important. And usually we mix all of these things together. And the trick with science is to kind of cut out or ignore the emotive part and focus on the data and the facts. Okay, so it's not about being a robot, but it is about changing the way that you think about a document. So let's take this portable document format paper, okay, Vinecki et al. 2017. This is the title page. This is the first page in which, of course, we can see the title. Okay, but everything that's on that page is important. It's important for finding the document. It's important to understand who did the science, who did the study. It's important for communication. We can actually talk to these people. We can write to them. We can phone them, and the information is here. And it's also important for the universities, for the institutions that were involved, because it shows that they were involved in the research. So when it comes to the identity of the document, in the past, this information was completely missing. You would just have the title and the author, and it was impossible to find anything. But nowadays, every scientific document will have at the top or on the first page or printed on every page the journal. And what we can see here in this first example is the name of the publication, which in this particular case is a scientific journal, but it could be the name of the book. It could be the title of the book. Okay. We can see the year of publication, which helps us find it. It's not just about knowing when it was done, but it also helps us to go to the library and find the right volume, the 2017 volume in this case, and physically search for this document. Then the documents are published in issues, which are collected into volumes, usually for each year. And in this case, 155 is the volume number, which happens to be the volume for 2017, but there could be more volumes, or it could be that a volume spans several years. It depends on the journal. The other important piece of information is the page numbers on which the document can be found. Usually this is the start and the end page numbers. Sometimes it's only the start number. And another thing which has become important over the last 10 years or so is something called the DOI. DOI. Maybe this is the most important thing, because when you're publishing, or when a document is published, there are several stages in that process, and it can take a long time to publish a scientific technical document. It can take months, it can take a year. And in the meantime, other things are being published, particularly with some fields of research. There's a lot of competition for publishing. So it really makes a difference that people know exactly what this document is and when it was published. And the DOI basically allows the document to be identified at all stages of production. So when the document is submitted, it gets a DOI, and it has this identification number which travels with it even after it's published, so that even when we're in the stage of producing the document, we can identify it. We can say, we started this a year ago. This is the document. Now it's published, but it's still basically the same document. So the digital object identifier is a code which we can use to search for any document at any point in the publication process. So looking at this title page again, I'll just very quickly talk about this before we talk about the main document structure. Very often we have an indication of the type of paper that it is, even before the title. In this particular case, the journal will publish research papers on different aspects of agricultural science. And this particular paper has been published in the section about crops and soils, and that's indicated. Okay, then we have the title itself. Here we have a problem of language. 100 years ago, when documents were published, they would be books with a title such as A Treatise on the Investigation of a Cherry Tree in somebody's lawn that has been investigated using a new method, and titles were enormous. But basically here we have the main message. We have a simple concept. We're looking at how to improve the chemical composition of coffee beans by irrigation and fertilization of the soil. It's all there in the title. This is a language concept. The title is the main message, and it needs to be short and concise. And a badly written document, a document that's difficult to read, has a really long title that doesn't have the main object of study as the main object of the title. But basically, we can see the title as the only really important thing. Everything else that comes after that supports the message. Very often these titles are, this is better if you do this. Okay, things like that. Very simple messages, and everything that comes after is to support that. Just to complete the presentation of the main title page, the other information that we have here then are the list of authors, okay, the author list. Very often there are particular authors that have a particular importance. The first author on the list is the person that wrote and did the main part of the study, okay? But other authors are also important. Usually the last author, even though they're last on the list, is a very important position, because this position shows that they managed the problem, they managed the project. Maybe they are the main professor or the main boss, the main supervisor, somebody with a fixed position that acts as a point of reference. And in fact, here, the last author is also the so-called corresponding author, the person that you can write to for more information. Okay, so they act as a fixed point of reference. Sometimes the first author is the corresponding author. Everyone else in the middle is somebody that did something, that really did something, that measured something, that wrote something, that contributed in a very real way to the paper, but they're not the people that managed or produced the study. So even the order of authors has a very particular significance, and it's very important. In fact, people can actually argue about this. Okay, I should be the second author because that shows that I had a very strong involvement in the technical side of the paper. So people get very annoyed. Apart from the first author and the last author, it's usually put into alphabetical order. But basically, the main author can decide that. We have also the list of participating institutions, which is called author affiliations. So again, this is very important for the university, for the institution to say, I was involved, we were involved in producing this science. And then usually there's a bit of information about how fast the publishing process was, because usually it's not fast. And journals like to show how good they are by showing how fast they published the paper, by how many months or years it took to publish the paper. Okay, it's not a very quick process. So the next bit of information that we have in a technical document is usually the summary. And in a scientific paper, it's usually called the abstract. Summary or abstract denotes the fact that it summarizes the main points of the paper. But the important thing is this: it's not just a simple statement saying you have to put nitrogen on the coffee plants to improve production. Again, there is a structure to this. There's a logical structure which reflects the whole paper. The paper is divided into introduction, methods, results, discussion, and conceptually, the summary is also divided. Maybe there aren't the subtitles, but the structure reflects the structure of the main document itself. This is something that very often people don't understand. They say, for example, it's difficult to cultivate coffee. We found a really good way and you have to do this. But there's nothing about what was done or the results that were found. So again, this supports the main message, which we can find in the title, but it also reflects the information that comes afterwards. The last bit of information about the document before we get to the main text itself are the keywords. Maybe you've heard of keywords, I don't know. Okay, but this is usually something that's undervalued by people. This is very important for searching for the document. When you do a search in Google, for example, if I put coffee production, these words might be in the title or in the abstract, and I can find that document really easily. But there could be subjects within the main text that aren't in the title, that aren't in the abstract, and that don't come out in a search unless they're in the keywords. The keywords are extra words. They're important words for the study, but words that aren't presented in the title or the abstract. Okay, so let's take a closer look at the text itself. I said that the summary or the abstract should reflect the main structure of the main text. Okay, and I have to be very clear about this, that it's something that people usually don't understand. We'll talk about this again tomorrow when we talk about writing. It's very important to understand the structure of the abstract when you're writing. But again, today we're looking at reading and interpreting, and when we look at this, we can interpret it. And in order to help us, I've underlined the different sections, the different concepts in different colors. So the first sentence, it could be the first sentence or the first two sentences, are the main concepts, the background, why the study is being conducted, and also the main questions that are being looked at by the study. But then we move on to the methods, what was actually done to test the question. So here I'm not adding previous information or results, it's simply what was done. And again, conceptually, we have this structure where we then move on to the results, the data. What was found, what was observed or measured or quantified in this study, with no reference to outside studies, no reference to previous work, what was found in this study. And then only at the end, not in with the results, but only at the end, we have the interpretation. So when it says discussion, what it means is taking the data from this paper and interpreting them, discussing them in the sense that you try and understand the data, and then you put that within the context of previous knowledge and discuss it. So this is where we come to the final message. What we're going to do now as an exercise is read a scientific abstract from a real scientific document, and it is literally the abstract from this paper about coffee production, which I'm going to read to you, but we have an exercise to do. And now you regret coming physically to this lesson because we're going to do this together. But it's a simple exercise. It's a quiz, a simple test in which I ask this question. How can the caffeine content of coffee beans be increased? How can we improve the caffeine content of coffee beans? There are three possible answers. Irrigation, so adding water, nitrogen fertilization of the soil, and phosphorus potassium, trying to translate into Italian while I speak, sorry, phosphorus fertilization of the soil. Irrigation, nitrogen fertilization, and phosphorus fertilization. Which of these increases the content of caffeine? Okay. I'm going to read that abstract and then we're going to answer this as an exercise in understanding the structure of this abstract. Here I go. Controlled irrigation during the dry period associated with adequate nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilization led to the accumulation and biochemical compounds in coffee beans considered as positive precursors of beverage quality. Adult plants of coffee, Coffea arabica cultivar ruby, were cultivated using different water regimes and fertilization conditions under the dry climate of the Brazilian Cerrado. Coffee bean physical characteristics were evaluated, as well as biochemical composition by near-infrared analysis. The potassium treatment mostly affected bean biochemistry, lipid, and chlorogenic acid contents, which increased with increasing amounts of fertilizer. Caffeine contents increased with higher amounts of nitrogen, but no significant effects of potassium treatment on bean biochemical composition were observed. Sucrose and total lipid contents always appeared higher in beans of non-irrigated plants than those beans from plants grown with continuous irrigation. In contrast, caffeine and chlorogenic acid contents were higher in beans of irrigated as compared to non-irrigated plants. For the first time, the current results showed that controlled management of irrigation during the dry period associated with reasonable NPK fertilization led to the accumulation of biochemical compounds in coffee plants, in coffee beans, considered as positive precursors of beverage quality. Okay, firstly, if we want to know if irrigation or N fertilization or P fertilization are important, we have to look towards the end of the abstract. So based on what I read and what you can see here, I want you to tell me what I can do to improve the caffeine content of my coffee beans.
Both irrigation and fertilization.
Are you sure? Okay, so the answer is irrigation and N fertilization, nitrogen fertilization, and that's it. I asked, are you sure? Because effectively phosphorus fertilization had no effect. So you have read and understood the abstract of a scientific document. You've interpreted it correctly, which is exactly what I want. There is no prize, there is no money, apart from the pride and the knowledge that you are at this level of understanding a scientific document. This is very important. Okay, so moving on from the abstract, we have the main document itself, the main body of text. So let's look at the main structure of the text, because I've said that the introduction, which is sometimes called the background, is about the problem that's being looked at in the study, but it's a bit more complicated than that. It starts from the problem. We have a problem knowing if we should irrigate or add nitrogen or phosphorus to improve coffee quality. Okay, this is the problem, but the introduction actually leads into the work that's being done. So it leads from the problem through how we can address the problem, how we can do something for that problem, to a very specific question. And actually, here I've used the word hypothesis, because I don't care about, can I improve coffee production? Can I improve coffee quality? It's not a question in that sense. A hypothesis is actually a statement. Okay, I can improve coffee quality with irrigation. And that is tested. And everything that comes after that, the methods and the results, is aiming to test that statement. So the research aims, the objectives, the research questions should always be expressed as a hypothesis, a testable statement, a yes or no statement. And this is one of the reasons why I say that scientific papers are actually a lot simpler than most people understand. Because at the end of the day, it all comes down to yes or no, or to be more correct, probably or probably not. Okay, because we always use statistics, which never give you absolute certainty. So hypotheses are probably refuted or probably supported. Okay, but it's basically a black or white situation. Basically yes, basically no. Okay, so scientific studies are actually a lot simpler than they seem. When we move on to the materials and methods, or simply methods section, it's saying what was done to address these hypotheses. Okay, and only that, only what was done to address the hypotheses. And it's a description of the methods, the techniques, the experimental design, or if the work is done in the field, what was done in the field, even observations in the field, but in enough detail that precisely or at least a very similar study can be repeated by other people. Okay, so I can have my particular experiments, somebody else can repeat those experiments and confirm what I've been saying. This is a very important part of science, repeating and confirming. This is a part of the quality control of science. And in order to do that, the materials and methods section has to communicate precise details as well. Then we move on to the results section. This is a description of the data. It should not have interpretation. Okay, so if I have a graph that shows that caffeine concentration increases, I can't say it increases because it increases and somebody else saw a similar thing. No, it just says the graph shows that it increases. Okay, it's a very simple description of the data with no interpretation whatsoever. Okay, then we have the discussion, which is essentially interpretation. So again, one of the mistakes that I see in a badly written paper or when somebody's writing a thesis is that they don't start with the main question. Okay, you're doing this work, or this work was done to address a particular question, a research objective, and it should start from that. It has to go back to the main objective and say, okay, the question was, if I irrigate and put nitrogen, I get better coffee. Our results show that if we irrigate and put nitrogen, we get better coffee. We confirm this. The discussion should not start with Mr. Smith, Professor Jones did a study in Johannesburg where they also, no. I don't care at the moment about other studies. We're coming back to the main research question. And eventually, after we've discussed our results, what we can present is the broader context of other studies. So this kind of structure is the kind of structure that we will see in any scientific document. It could be a technical document, a report from a project, or a scientific paper. Even a book, in a sense, starts from a problem, goes through what's known about the problem, what can be done to improve the problem, recent results, and then it goes to a more speculative stage towards the end, interpreting. And so even a bigger document such as a book will have the same basic similar structure. But once again, one of the main things that I'm communicating to you is that the messages themselves are very simple. We can take a paragraph, such as the paragraph from the introduction here, and it actually has a very simple message. In this particular case, the first paragraph is saying coffee is important to the Brazilian economy. And then we have lots of information that supports that. We have numbers, how many kilograms, how many millions of bags of beans, where you can go to get this information, the websites, supporting information in terms of other studies, but it's all kind of extra supporting information for a very simple message. Coffee is important to the Brazilian economy. Okay, and then of course the document itself is organized in paragraphs, and this paragraph is coffee is important. You put a little label on it. This is the coffee is important paragraph. If I start talking about other things, or if I read other things in there, then it's wrong. It's a badly written document that's difficult to interpret. The next paragraph is a different subject, a different concept. It's a different box with different information in it, different supporting information. In this particular case, it's about drought. Okay, so coffee is important. Drought affects coffee production. This is the next concept. And in particular, drought affects the physiology of the coffee plant. So there's a progression, and the progression is by jumping from one box to another. Okay, and I repeat, this is a cultural thing that is very often used in English, but I don't see it in Italian. I don't know if you're not taught it, but it doesn't seem to come out. And I repeat, very often I see paragraphs which are single sentences, and it doesn't do this. But the text is a mechanism that should work. It has a progression. Whenever we see citations, references, this is very important, because in a scientific document, you cannot simply say, in the past, there was an experiment looking at coffee production. You have to indicate what it was. You have to indicate who did it. You can't say anything without any supporting information. I could write, for example, in an introduction of a paper, grass is green. But until I put supporting information, it's just an opinion, and that's not science. There are two ways that I can put the supporting information. I can cite somebody else's work. So between parentheses, I put a citation to their work. Or I can say grass is green, and the citation is a little bit different. I can use as supporting information my data. Okay, it's another way of supporting. So the graphs, the figures that we find in an article are simply a different way of providing support to a statement. And in fact, one of the concepts that we'll look at in a bit is that the graph itself is not really all that important. I don't really care when I read a graph if lines go up, if it goes down, and what's important is that that graph is supporting a statement in English. Okay, so caffeine production is increased. It's not, the graph in itself is not important, it's the statement that's important. When we look at citations then, we have an indication of the name of the authors. Et al. Is an abbreviation for et alia, and it simply means and others. It's just a way of being more concise. This is important for reading, okay? When we, as a general rule for reading and writing documents, the more concise it is, it's easier to read and easier to write. And again, the concept here with reading documents is that your eye learns to skip over this supporting information and to concentrate on the main message. Okay, so again, we have a paragraph, and what we have to do is learn to skip over the references and skip over and ignore the supporting information. We know that it's there. If we need to, we can go and look at it, okay? But when you're reading, what you have to learn to do is to skip over the extra information. So in this particular case, we have a paragraph which simply says, drought affects the yield and quality of coffee beans. If I want, I can go and look at the other citations, the other work, but I don't really need to. I kind of trust it for now. I can go and look into that, but I trust this, and there's only one simple message that comes out. So the message from all of this is that the effects on the quality of the bean affect the quality of the drink. It's quite simple when you learn how to ignore most of what's written. Okay, what's written is important, all the supporting information, But the trick to reading a document like this is to ignore most of it, to understand the main message and ignore some of the details. I just wanted to point out in this particular case, the citation is a bit different because it's a review article. And basically that's a way of saying, go and see this long authoritative paper which reviews all of the literature on this subject, which helps me to avoid putting a huge list of citations in the text and making it very difficult to read. So for a review, go and see this other document. Again, it's supporting information, supporting the main message. So again, I don't need to go into every paragraph, but hidden, and this is the trick, hidden in each paragraph is a very simple message. When we get to the materials and methods section, everything changes. It becomes very different. We see lots and lots of details. So here we have, for example, the field site, even the geographic coordinates, the elevation, the altitude of the field site, all sorts of really, really precise information. It's very different, because the aim here is not to be interesting. It's not part of a story. It's to provide the details for somebody to repeat the study. Okay, and so it's conceptually very different. It's communicating the details, but even here, there is a structure. There is a very precise structure to how materials and methods sections should be written in a paper, or even in a thesis, okay, any scientific document. And again, this is something that a lot of people don't understand, but there is an actual defined structure. And it goes basically from general to specific. It goes from materials, things that were used, in this particular case, plants, an experimental area, a place, okay. But basically from the materials, the raw materials, to the data, the numbers, the things that are evaluated, measured, okay, and the interpretation. So in this particular case, we see the plant material that was used, the experimental treatments, the irrigation and the nitrogen treatments, for example, how the numbers were generated, how the numbers were counted, how things were processed and done. Then we have things like chemical analysis of the samples, analysis of the samples, and then a statistical analysis of the numbers. Okay, again, it seems obvious this, but you'd be amazed at how many papers and how many manuscripts don't understand this basic structure for taking the reader from the start to the finish, okay, because the document is actually I'd like to say a river or a train or something a bit silly where the reader is taken from one point to another. But the point is that the person that's writing should take your hand and bring you step by step to the conclusion. So a good document will have this particular series of steps that goes from general to specific, which I think I've even put as a little arrow. Okay, so it's going from general to specific, the raw materials to the production of data. Now, I said before that in a scientific paper, one of the support citations for a message, the grass is greener, caffeine is higher, there's more caffeine. One of the ways of supporting this is with graphs. Okay, so the results section is basically doing that. It's providing support for statements. So again, I don't really care if there's a circle over here or a circle over there. I have to describe the data, but I'm doing it to support the message. That's the important thing. The way that this is done in papers is to write the message. So, for example, there are different effects based on different irrigation regimes. That's the important thing. That's the message. Everything else supports that. And look, figure 3 between parentheses. If this were the introduction, between the parentheses, we'd have a paper, a name, Davis et al. It's a citation. So again, here we have a citation. We have supporting information for the statement. In this particular case, it's my information. That's the difference. I don't care about the graph itself. It's supporting the statement. The way that this is done, the technical way that this is done, is that any statement that's made in the text must be supported. So there must be a figure, or you don't say it, or it's not written. Okay. So in this particular case, we have figure 3, and in the text, we have the citation of figure 3. If we have figure 12 or figure 21, and they're not talked about in the text, they shouldn't even be there. It's too much. When we come to the discussion, again, we're talking about an interpretation of these results, of these messages. I've said that there's more caffeine. I've also showed the supporting data for that. But I'm talking about these messages supporting the hypothesis. So it's very important when they write in the present study or the data show. This is very correct. This is the correct way in which documents should present the data, because it is about supporting the main messages, the main questions of the paper. Very often in scientific documents, we have a concluding paragraph. This is very common nowadays. In the past, it wasn't always like this, but it's a kind of summary about the results and interpretation. So it's like the abstract or the main summary of the document, but just the last half with some details. It's the results and what it means as a kind of reminder of the importance of the study. So it's an extra paragraph. It can be a paragraph in the main text, but explicit that it is the conclusion paragraph. So it starts with in conclusion, or we can conclude that, or this section can be literally another section. So the conclusion section with a subtitle, etc., etc. Okay, so I've given you a very detailed presentation of the document, of the structure of a document. Just to be complete, I'll give you some extra information about the supporting information for a document. There should always be, for example, the acknowledgement section, which is important to thank people who have helped you. This is true, but it's also the place where your funding, the financing is indicated. And for scientific papers, it's very important that the financing bodies, the people that have given money, are thanked. Because it ties into a whole range of things, like if the authors will get funding again in the future, the kind of publicity for the funding body. So this kind of thing is very, very important, and it has a particular structure. Nowadays, most scientific papers will have an extra section which is only accessible online, and this is the actual data that went into the paper. In the past, this wasn't done. It was just the paper, the main graphs, and the interpretation. But that data represents money. It represents projects, financing that have generated the data, and the data should be available. There are several reasons for this. One, because it's making the most value out of the money that was spent. And the other is, of course, quality control, checking, people can go and check. They can run their own analysis on the data and check that what has been said in the paper is actually correct. So data accessibility is a very important part of scientific publication nowadays. And this is very often in the form of so-called supporting information, anything that helps. And this could even be supporting figures. These are figures or tables of data which are available online, and they take this kind of special symbol, S1, supporting 1, S2, figure S3, to indicate that they're not in the main text, but they are available online. And then the last section of the paper is usually the reference list or the literature cited. Watch out, because something that I see in theses and books is something called a bibliography. Bibliography is about books, and that's it. But we're saying that scientific information comes mainly from papers. This is the original source of information. And scientific papers are not books, they're not biblio. Bibliography is actually the wrong term to use when you're talking about the primary scientific literature. These are references, or citations, or more correctly, literature cited. So this is the correct way in which you should see the reference list presented. So references, reference list, literature, literature cited, citations, but not bibliography. Bibliography is actually wrong because it would just be the books. References or literature cited has everything in it. It could be a scientific article which has a particular way in which it's presented, or a book, or even a book chapter, and this has a particular way in which it's presented, which is important. This is important. If you're writing a thesis, for example, or a project report, any kind of formal scientific document, you cannot invent the way that the references are presented. This is another thing that I learned when I was doing my doctorate, that I started writing references. Smith, the year, I'll make it quick. I'll just leave off those numbers at the end, okay? But everything here is important for finding the document. So the name of the publication, the journal, the volume number, even the year, everything helps you to find the information. And there's a basic set of information which is absolutely necessary. And it's this: the authors, which are kind of abbreviated, shortened to the surname and the initials usually, the date of publication, the title, or in this case, the title of a paper, and then the journal or publication title, which is usually written in italics to make it different from the title of the actual document. Then we have the volume number and the page numbers, or the range of page numbers. A book or another document is written in a slightly different way, but even here there's a slight amount of variability allowed. For example, the date can be between parentheses or without the parentheses. The volume number can be bold or not. Okay, there is a little bit of variation in how this can be done, but you can't make up every part of it. And when you read documents, these are the kind of formats that you see, and everyone understands it, and everyone can use it to go and find the document. The particular style that's used should be consistent. It can't change within a reference list, and usually it reflects the house style, the format of the particular editing house. So for example, in this document, it will follow the same format of all of the other scientific papers in that journal, and this is called the house style. House means publishing house, okay, or journal style. So we have the authors, the date, and you only really see these kind of formats. The title of the actual document, the publication title, which can be written in full or abbreviated, then the volume. And okay, so there's slight variation, but we always have the same basic information to help us to find the document. Book citations are a little bit different because in this particular case, the publication is also the title of the document. And because publication names are usually written in italics, then the title of the document is also written in italics. This is the main difference. So we have the authors, the date, the title of the document and publication, the publishing house, and a basic address, the name of the city and the country, and sometimes you will find added on the page numbers, the total number of pages in the book, in the document. Book chapters are a little bit different because you have the title of the document within a book. So here we have indicated in this book. Okay, so there are different ways of presenting the different types of documents, but everyone understands how this is done. The only real differences are with two very particular scientific journals, Nature and Science. These are the most, well, there are a few others as well, but these are basically the most important scientific journals. And what that means is that everyone reads them, every library takes these particular journals, and it means that everyone wants to publish in them. And that means that they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents in them. and that becomes a cost for publication. And it means that to save money, they save space. To save space, they understand this concept that you can kind of ignore the references. It's all about the main messages. It's enough that there's a little number that indicates a concise version of the references, and that's okay. That's it. That's all the information you need. So if you read Nature or Science, you'll find a slightly different system for citing the literature or for presenting the references, which has these little numbers above the text. It's actually much easier to read, but it's also much more difficult to produce as an author, so it's not something that a lot of people like to do. So we've seen that the structure of the paper is standardized in a way, and it's logical, and it presents things in categories and boxes with a particular aim, a particular objective. Usually when we speak or we communicate, we do this with a mixture of knowledge, but also emotion and emotiveness, communicating how we're feeling. This is a natural way of communicating. But this has to change slightly in scientific writing. We have to change it actively. We have to think about it and change it. Writing is a form of communication, and what we want to communicate will determine how we write, how we communicate that message. For example, the emotive side of communication. I feel, that's great, that's big. Poetry. This is all about feelings, and none of that comes into science. Scientific writing is very different from poetry. Okay, scientific writing communicates knowledge, it communicates ideas and supporting information for those ideas, basically. Now, when we speak, of course, there's the full range of human communication, including emotions and knowledge, and this is how we usually think when we express ourselves. So when I talk to a person, I have this full range of emotion and knowledge and everything. The real trick with scientific writing, with technical writing, is to try and cut out the emotive side and just present the knowledge. Okay, this is very difficult because it means turning off part of your natural communication mechanism. So it's something that can only really be learned with practice. By doing it very often, you can switch off the emotive side while you're writing. Now, in science, they very often say that a scientist has to be detached from their work. They have to be objective. They can't be enthusiastic about their work. They can't love their work. But this is not exactly the truth. The truth is that in order to work in a particular field of research, you have to love it. You have to enjoy it. You have to have enthusiasm for it. Otherwise, the work would become extremely dull. I became a botanist because I had my own personal passion about learning how plants grow and the different kinds of plants. So I wouldn't be a scientist if I didn't have passion for it, if I didn't have emotion and emotive thoughts about it. The real trick with scientific communication is understanding when you're communicating facts and figures or emotions and switching off the emotions. So the point about scientific objectivity and scientific detachment is to have that passion and have that interest, but in the background, to switch it off, to recognize when your communication is ideas and facts or emotion, and to try and switch off the emotion, okay? So this is the way that you have to think when you're writing. I'll just give you one example of that, the difference between scientific and emotive writing. This is an extract from William Wordsworth's poem, Daffodils. And this phrase, this paragraph, is basically what he's saying with this is that when he has difficult moments in his life, when he finds it very difficult to go on with things, he thinks back to this moment in his life, which is an inspiration, where he understands the beauty of the world and it helps him to carry on. So I'll read this first in an emotive way, in a poetic way, as William Wordsworth would have said it, hopefully. And then what I'll do is I'll transliterate this. I'll kind of translate it into scientific writing. So I'll start with a poetry, hopefully. I'm not a very good poet. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Now I'm going to change that into scientific writing, because it's not about the feelings, it's about the knowledge, the facts, and the ideas. And it actually comes out a lot shorter. This is the point. It comes out a lot shorter. Scientific writing is very, very concise. Let me read this. It's very different, but it's communicating the same scientific knowledge in a way. I was walking alone when I suddenly saw 153 plants of Narcissus poeticus dispersed throughout the environment. Okay, it's very precise. There's the location, the circumstances, the number of plants, the species of plants. So it's giving the facts, and that's it. There is no, I felt, this was great, all very nice. No, it is just the facts. And that's the kind of thinking that you have to have when you're writing your master's thesis, when you're writing a doctoral thesis, when you're writing a technical report for a project, when you're writing a book, when you're writing a scientific letter, a professional letter. So what I want to do is teach you how to write scientifically using these kind of tricks. And it's mainly about the way that you think about it and the structure. The document structure is important. So the most important skills for scientific writing, for good scientific writing, firstly is experience. So experience of the topic and knowledge of the published scientific literature. I'll go through these one by one and then I'll talk about them each, okay? The second thing is understanding document structure. This is something that we looked at in the last lesson, but understanding how documents are created, the architecture of a document, will help you to write, okay? The other thing, and this is particularly important, and it's something that I actually enjoy, is the ability to précis, the ability to summarize. Okay, it comes from the French, but it means to make a summary of a text or document. We'll see later on that usually this word is used in literature when somebody is summarizing somebody else's book. But a précis, this concept of summarizing, can be important in science because you can write a page of a document and then précis it, make it more compact and smaller and concise, but keep the same meaning. So this is a very important skill that I'll be teaching you after document structure. And the last crucial skill for good scientific writing is based on the fact that you're not alone. You're not a single person. You have other people around you. You have other scientists, you have your supervisor, you have people with experience, and you can share your work and edit and change what you've written based on their experience. Sometimes this can be a painful process because you may have to cut things that you've spent a lot of time writing, but that is an important skill, understanding what really isn't necessary and even cutting it out. So I'll be looking at these 4 scientific skills in the next slides. We'll start off with experience of the topic and knowledge of the published scientific literature. This is the first thing that you need to write well. Okay, so experience of the topic and knowledge of the scientific literature. This is actually the most difficult thing because it's an example of catch-22. From the first lesson, we learned that a catch-22 situation is a difficult paradox, something that you can't get over. Because in the example that I gave of a catch-22, in order to get experience, in order to get a job, you need job experience. In order to get job experience, you need a job. It's the same kind of catch-22 here. The only way that you can get experience is to read papers and do the work. There is no easy way into it, and it's based on gradually getting experience. So this is the thing that's really very difficult for students. It's difficult at the master's degree level, for example. and it basically needs some active work to read the scientific literature and to stay in the lab and do work and then write about your work more than anything else. So there's really not much that I can say about this apart from apply yourself and get experience, okay? So I'll move on to understanding the document structure. Now, we did look at document structure in the last lesson in terms of interpreting documents, and I use the example of scientific papers because they're the most concise scientific and technical documents, and they're also quality controlled by the peer review system. And today I'll be using scientific papers as an example again. But one of the things that we learned was that structure is important because it's not just about titles and subtitles. It's about dividing the concepts, having separate boxes in which we put different ideas. And then the other concept that we learn is that each idea, you can take it just as a simple idea, but understand that within that box, within that paragraph, within that section, there is supporting information to back up that idea. Okay, so basically, one of the things that I said was that scientific documents are full of details, they're full of information, but they're actually more simple than they seem because it is actually a series of simple statements. The grass is green, the grass is not green, and then there's lots of information to back that up. Okay, to show that it's true or to show that it's not true. So the main messages in a scientific document are actually quite simple yes or no kind of situations. So we looked at the document structure, that there's a very different, very definite difference between what you write in an introduction, and methods, results, and discussion. Okay, so the introduction again is the problem and the state of the art. The methods section is what you did to look at this problem, the results in a very, very clear way, what you found, just what you found, and that's it, with no interpretation, okay, no discussion at all. The discussion section is a separate section in which there's interpretation of the data and speculation about what it means. Okay, so we saw this in the last lesson. But when you're writing a document, you come to the end of your master's degree, towards the end of your master's degree, or your doctoral degree, or maybe you're working even as a research scientist or in some kind of job where you have to produce a report. You have to make a document, a physical document, a thing, okay? You have to make that. And sometimes these documents can be big and scary. Difficult, scary. It is difficult to start writing because it is a big job. It's a job that takes a long time, weeks or months. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you get started on something like this, on a document that seems so complex? Well, from my own personal experience, I think there are two ways that are useful to start writing. When you're involved in a project or in any kind of work, you have an idea of why you're doing that work. You have an idea of the main research question. Okay, you have that in your head. But as the work has progressed and you've got to the point where you have to write about it, you have then an idea, the main research objective, and you have the results. You have graphs, you have data, you have tables, numbers, figures. And those results will be related to the main research objective. So actually, when you're writing, when you start writing your master's thesis, for example, a good place to start is actually just after the middle in the results section. I'll put the laser pointer on. So the results section, because you know this is a definite starting point, a good foundation, because you do know what was measured, what was seen, what was observed. So this can be a really good point around which you build the rest of the document. Okay. So in this particular case, I have a graph. I've measured, in this case, germination of a plant. okay? Different kinds of plants, different kinds of cultivars, it doesn't matter. I have data, I have a graph. That tells a story. There's a message there, okay? Germination is higher for this plant, lower for this plant. I can use that as a starting point. Okay, the other way that you can start writing one of these massive, difficult documents is to start from a place that maybe doesn't seem like a good starting point, from the abstract, from the summary. Usually when people write research papers, they write the main text first, and then at the end, they kind of add the abstract on later, something that you have to do later. Okay, but actually think about it again. What I said yesterday was that a scientific paper represents a single clear message, and everything else supports that message. The main message is actually in the title and in the abstract. And these are also the things that are freely available to anyone on the internet without paying, okay, at least the title and the abstract. So these are the most visible and important parts of the document. The other thing is that if you can write the abstract, if you can write the summary in a clear and concise way, then it shows that you're thinking about it in a clear and concise way. It shows that you can express what you're doing, why you're doing it. This is a difficult process. Maybe you've worked for a year in the laboratory and you've done all sorts of things, and you have to condense that work into a few sentences in the summary. But if you spend time getting this right, if you concentrate on summarizing and getting the abstract correct, then it sets the scene for everything else that you have to write. So if you spend some time getting the abstract correct, getting the main ideas with just a little bit of supporting information in there, just the main values that really support the main research objectives, then all the rest of the document will come out after that. Okay. As we'll see later, writing, starting the process of writing is very difficult for anybody that has to write, not just scientists, but even if somebody's writing a book, there is this, well, in English, we call it writer's block. It's where a writer just doesn't know where to start. So I hope that by giving you an indication of where to start, we can get over this writer's block and get you started writing your document. So let's imagine that we've started writing the text of the document, the main text. I think a good way of summarizing document structure, this is something additional to what I said yesterday, is what I call an hourglass structure. Now, when I started writing, when I was at university, I was told this very simple concept of the hourglass structure. And what it says is that a document should start very generally and become more and more specific to get to a single idea. And then it becomes more general again as you test that idea and as you discuss what you've seen, and then as you speculate more widely and more generally towards the end in the context of other work. So if we look at a document and we start out very generally, well, this of course is the introduction section. You start with a general description of the problem, the kind of work that has been done in the past to look at this problem, what we can do to address this problem, and then some very specific testable statements or hypotheses, very, very specific. Everything that comes after should be in the context of these hypotheses, coming back to them and addressing them. So this is what we call the hourglass structure, and it's something that you should have in your document, especially a scientific document. When it comes to writing in general, and especially to get over this problem of writer's block, there is actually a method, okay? And I've taken this method, I've taken this text from Webster's New World Letter Writing Handbook, okay? Because there are books about writing, there are books about writing books, there are books about writing letters, there are books about writing theses, and so I've taken some of this information and presented it here. This is a very interesting concept. It's called the three-step writing process. So the process of writing, if you split it up into 3 steps, you can get started and then write well. And the idea is that there are 3 main phases: writing, rewriting, and polishing. In English, polishing means to put the final details, get it really, really perfect. I don't think there's a good translation into Italian, but it means that when you have something that's almost complete, you just get it nice and shiny and perfect. Okay, so that's polishing. The main thing, okay, the first thing is writing, and what this means is that you simply write. It doesn't necessarily have to be correct or even very good, but you get something onto the page, because this helps you to get over writer's block. It helps you to get started, and you can correct it afterwards. We're not in the 1850s with a typewriter and what we type is forever. Okay, we have word processors and computers. We can change it. It's perfectly okay to write something that we change later. The idea is to get going. So what it says here is to go with the flow, to just write what comes out as it comes, like a river, okay, with the flow of a river. And it says about words tumbling out. Okay, so the words should tumble out and flow, and it doesn't really matter what they are. It gives you a base from which you can work. The next section, rewriting, this is where it gets more critical, where it gets more specific, and where it gets more correct. Okay, this is a process of editing, reorganization, looking at the logic, the argument, the content of it, and if you're getting your message across, if you're persuading and communicating. So this is really where the writing gets more specific. The last part then is polishing. Very often when people write, they would write a sentence and even put in maybe some values, some supporting information, like figure 3 shows that this is 10%. Okay, this is where you look at the very specific details, the numbers. Is it actually figure 3? Is it 10%? Let me look at that again. Let me look at, is it percent or microliters? So you look at the very, very specific details and make sure that the quality of the document is correct. So this is the 3-step writing process, and it should help you with writing anything, but especially a scientific document where the polishing phase is very important to the accuracy and the correctness and the quality of what you're writing. Okay, what I want to do now, before I talk about précis and this idea of compressing and making the document more concise, which is very important. Before I do that, I want to look at a manuscript as a physical document. I don't necessarily mean physical in the sense of printed, although it can be printed, but as you write, what is it that you create? You're not writing with a pen on a piece of paper. Very often we're talking about documents, of course, maybe a Word document or a rich text format document. I've put emphasis on Word documents and rich text files, rich text format, because if you're publishing, for example, you've done your master's thesis and something really amazing has come out and you want to publish this officially, very often publishing houses will only accept Microsoft Word documents or rich text format files. So it's actually important, this, talking about the mechanics of what you're writing, what you're producing as a physical document. So the next couple of slides, I want to talk in this kind of context, as if we're writing a thesis or creating a document with the aim of publishing it. And there's a very particular way of doing this. For example, the pages of the document. When we submit a manuscript, we create a manuscript for publication, for example, the first page is actually called the title page. It's a very specific page. It doesn't have any main text on it. It doesn't have the abstract on it. It has the title, the authors, and the affiliations, and what you can see here, okay? The second page of a manuscript document, a manuscript file, is where we put the abstract or the summary with the keywords under the abstract. It's generally like this. It's almost always like this. If we're creating a manuscript and we send it to any publishing house in the world, this is the kind of thing that they expect. And you'll have noticed that there are spaces between the lines. Now, spacing between the lines is very important. It's important for a thesis. It's important for a manuscript document. It's not something that you see in a final printed document, but in a manuscript or a thesis. Yes, why? Because other people will read this. Other people will comment on this. If you present a doctoral thesis, for example, you will do this in front of a committee of people, and they need to be able to write on your document. They take your document and they write between the lines of text. And so a manuscript file has this particular structure of spacing between the lines to give an editor or a reviewer or a committee member the possibility of writing on your document. Okay, it's only after publication when things get compressed into the usual printed form. Another thing that you can see is that there are line numbers. Again, this helps an editor or a reviewer to talk about a particular point within the text. Look at line 12, you've spelt the word wrong, for example. Now, we looked at summaries and abstracts in the last lesson, and we talked about structure and the fact that the abstract in miniature, in a very concise way, should nonetheless reflect the structure of the entire document. Okay, so it's important when you're writing an abstract that you keep this in mind. You keep the aim of the document in mind, and you summarize in a very, very concise way the background, the materials and methods, the results, and the discussion. So let's look at these sections in the main text, because we did talk about this yesterday. There'll be a little bit of repetition here, but bear with me, because here we can see an actual manuscript document. We can see the line numbers again, for example. And again, the aim of the introduction is to take the reader from a general problem down to a specific hypothesis. And usually within a manuscript, this is done within between 2 or 4 pages. So with a scientific paper or a project report, the aim is not to write a book. It's not to show that you know everything, but it's to take the reader through this story in the quickest way possible, but the most correct way possible. And the aim of the introduction is really to get to the hypothesis, the testable statement. And again, a hypothesis is not a question, okay? A hypothesis is not, is the grass green? No, the hypothesis is the grass is green, and I can go and test that with the rest of the study and say yes or no, or probably yes, probably not. Okay, so the hypothesis is not a question, and a badly written document will have a question with a question mark, and a good document will have a hypothesis, which is a testable statement. Okay, so the hypothesis is really the main point of the introduction, and usually we underline this by creating a last paragraph, a box, a section, just for the hypothesis. This is an example of that from a paper which I've written, a published paper, in which it's clearly stated what the hypothesis, in this particular case, 2 hypotheses, what these hypotheses state and what we're going to look at. Okay, everything else that comes later in the document, the methods, the results, the discussion, the conclusions, must come back to this. It's based on this. If we have anything else in the document that isn't related to testing the hypothesis, then it shouldn't be in the document. This is actually an important point for writing, because there's a tendency to put everything that you've done into a piece of work. You've done your master's thesis, you're writing it, and during your master's work, you did 3 different studies, 3 different experiments. One of them didn't work, and it's not really related to the main research questions, but you did it, so you're going to put it in. No. The point is that everything should be very specifically addressed to the hypotheses. And if there's anything else, then it should be cut out. And learning how to cut out, how to edit, and how to edit yourself is difficult. It's a difficult skill to learn. It's a painful thing sometimes. Maybe you've put a month of your life into doing a piece of work, but if it's not related to the hypothesis, it shouldn't be in the document. The other thing that we can see here is that the hypotheses are in their own section, they're in their own paragraph. Now, I did talk about this yesterday, that in English in particular, we're always taught that paragraphs are extremely important. You shouldn't have separate sentences with, we don't have separate sentences in English. We have paragraphs, we have these boxes where we have a main message and then statements which are related to that message, maybe information, data, which supports that message. But each paragraph is a step along the journey, and every step is its own thing, its own argument, its own subject. So it's very important to use paragraphs effectively. Just so that you know, in English, we very often indent the first word of the paragraph. This is something that I don't see in Italian. I don't see indentation or separation of the paragraphs. In Italian, I see very often documents with single non-indented paragraphs, single sentences as paragraphs. And the whole point of this is that as a writer, you're trying to make it easier for the reader to follow what you're saying. Easier for the reader, simply their eye, to follow the text. And if that text is in different sentences here and there, it's not indented, it becomes physically difficult to read the document. So your job as a writer is to create that structure with these mechanisms and to help the reader. So keep that in mind when you're writing. You're helping the reader. We saw this a little bit yesterday with the materials and methods section, when I said that the methods section is about taking the reader from the general materials that we used through the experimental treatments and the sample collection, through the quantification, the measurement, the actual data values, finally to the data processing and the actual statistical analysis. So going from materials to a statistical analysis of the data. And this is a very definite structure. And again, you're helping the reader to get through that. In this particular case of materials and methods, there's something else that we have to do. We have to make sure that what we've done can be reproduced by somebody else. This is a key part of science, repetition, and giving people the possibility to confirm your work. It's a key part of quality control in science. So very often what we'll see in the materials and methods and what you should write is very specific details. Just one example of that. In this particular study, it used a particular mechanical device. If somebody needs to repeat this study, they need the same device or they need something that's very similar. So this is very detailed. We even give the name and address of the company that built that mechanical device. Okay, so in the materials and methods section, we have to be very, very specific about everything. These are things that we will find in theses, in project reports, in scientific papers. We need this kind of level of detail, including references, citations, where you can find extra detail. So, for example, this is a paragraph taken from a paper about measuring photosynthesis in plants. I chose it because that's what I do, but equally this could be a scientific paper on anything. But it does actually provide a lot of details about the experiment, the experimental setup, the treatment, what equipment was used, what was measured, and then some references to other studies where these methods were also used. So this is the kind of general level of detail that you have to put into your materials and methods section. One of the most important concepts from yesterday was that the results of a study, the graphs, the tables, the data, the analysis, are not the important things in themselves. All of those are supporting a statement, a message, an idea. Okay. In a scientific technical document, the ideas, the messages are supported by data in the form of graphs and tables, and there is a very particular way of doing that, a correct way of doing it. And if it's not done in this way, then it's more difficult to read. Okay. Aside from being more difficult to read, an editor might say that it's incorrect. And so there are particular ways of doing it. For example, when it comes to figures, graphs, we can see a graph here, which is made of 3 panels, 3 separate graphs together in one unified graph. Okay, there is a particular way of presenting figures. In the text, usually the word figure is abbreviated, and of course the figure is the citation, it's the support for the main message. So when you write the main text, you have your message, and then you say something like, this is shown in figure 1 and figures 3 and 4. Okay, there's an explicit reference to a figure. If you say something in a scientific study, it has to be supported. It can be supported by an outside citation of somebody else's work and data, or an internal citation to your own data. Okay, in this particular case, the figure. So this is supporting evidence. When it comes to photographs or photomicrographs, in the case that we see here, these are images taken with a scanning electron microscope or optical microscope. Photographs, micrographs, graphs, they are all figures. So these are figures. This is figure. We can see it in the legend of the text, figure. Apart from the fact that everything is a figure, okay, photos, photomicrographs, etc., the legend of the figure should go on the same page, okay, ideally. It should have a description of everything that's in that figure, even a miniature description of the study, because the idea is that if somebody has a photocopy of only that one page, they should be able to understand the figure. This legend then, which always goes underneath the figure, should have a basic description of the study. So they can be miniature paragraphs in their own right. It's not enough to say photos of grass leaves. It's not enough. So it has details of what's being measured, what's being shown, a miniature description of this particular experiment. So whenever there are figures, they should be well explained, enough to understand what's in the figure. Okay. Again, how are these things physically produced? This looks extremely complicated. These are 6 different graphs together in one figure. This requires a bit of knowledge, a bit of skill to create. So the way that this is done is usually with specialized software. I've got some examples here: SigmaPlot, the R statistical package, or even Microsoft Excel, which is very general, maybe for good scientific work. Excel is not the best, but anyway, there's a simple idea here. Notice that I said that you can produce graphs in a statistical package. Actually, these graphs are not just about presentation. They're also about testing hypotheses. You have a hypothesis for your work, and this graph actually tests that. Yes or no, there is support for it, probably or probably not. Here, for example, we don't just see the data points, but there is a statistical analysis added to this, which gives us the possibility to support or refute a hypothesis. So it's not just about presentation, it's also about testing hypotheses and even statistical tests. When you perform a statistical test, again, the idea is not about the numbers, it's not about the graph, it's about saying yes or no to a statement, to a hypothesis, to a message. So even statistics are about hypothesis testing. So we can do this in actually in any of these: Excel, R, which everyone is using nowadays, Sigma plot, all of them have graphical presentation capabilities, but the important thing for us is that they all have statistical analysis as a part of this graphing. Okay, so if you're going to do any scientific study, you have to learn how to use one of these packages, and I would suggest using the R statistical package because it's much more flexible than any of the other packages. It's also free, okay, and everyone is using it now. When it comes to figures, all of the figures must be necessary. Again, if you've spent a year doing lots of work, you don't have to put everything in. And any figures that you do put in must be referenced within the text. Again, there's a simple reason for this, because the figure is supporting the message in the text. Okay, the main important thing is the message, not the graph itself. So for every message you have, you should have a graph, and for every graph, you should be supporting a message. Okay, now science can get a bit complicated and presenting data can be complicated. Something that I see very often is the tendency to put everything into one graph. Okay, but this gets very, very confusing. One skill that is important to learn is how to divide information into little pieces that you can bite one at a time and digest very easily. Again, it's about making it easier for the reader to understand and to follow the information. So in this particular example, we have a highly confusing graph, which we've split up into very simple single messages. Part of producing a document, physically producing the document, is thinking about how it will be used. Maybe it's not quite so common now, but in the past, photocopying documents from the library was very important. But aside from photocopying, maybe we have a document, we want to read it on the train, and the screen on the phone is very small, so it gets printed off. Printing in color is very costly, photocopying in color is very costly, but very often our color documents are translated into black and white or shades of gray, grayscale. So photocopying, printing in grayscale. And that's a problem, because if the graph is presented with certain colors which are very similar, particularly green and red and green, this is a particular problem for people with color blindness, people that can't distinguish between red and green. Photocopying or color blindness will make everything seem the same, and we lose information. So when we create our graphs, when we create our document, we should always think of the worst situation in which it's going to be read. It's going to be read by somebody with a bad, dirty photocopy in the toilet of a train. Okay, if we think about the scenario where it's going to be used, then we can design our figures and our graphs accordingly. For example, this is a real graph from one of my papers in which different groups or different treatments are represented by patterns and shades of gray. Okay, black and white, gray. And when it's photocopied, and the person is having their moment on the train, reading the printed document, the same information is present. There is no information loss. Color figures also have another disadvantage, that they're costly to print. If you send a document, a manuscript, to be published, one of the limits to publication is the cost of pages which are printed in color. And very often that cost will come to you as an author, and you have to pay for it. So it really should only be used when it's absolutely necessary. Figures are usually used in the results section, never in the discussion. Okay, so in a technical document or a scientific paper, the figures should not be in the discussion section. With a thesis, with a master's thesis or a doctoral thesis, you can have a figure in the discussion if it's really, really necessary. But usually the figures are supporting information which is presented before. There is one exception to this, to the figures being results, and that is where you're setting up the experimental system. In the materials and methods, maybe you need to talk about the physical location, the experiment itself, maybe even the organisms that are involved in the study. And in that particular case, you can have a figure in the materials and methods section. So this is an actual manuscript where we can see how the figures are then put into the document. And this all happens after the text, after the references. After the reference section of our text, we have tables of information. Laser pointer. We have tables, and then as the last thing, we have figures. So they're not actually in the main text in a manuscript document, in a document which is sent for publication. Although, of course, in a thesis, they will be inserted in the main text itself. Usually when it comes to a manuscript, there's a separate page which lists all of the figure legends separately so that the editor can understand what the figures are talking about. But I want to talk about something very important now, which is how results, figures, and information are interpreted and presented. Very often, one of the things that I would see for a description in the results section is something like the graph shows that the line goes up towards the right. Okay, it's not about the graph itself. It's not even about the numbers. The main thing that you should understand is that this information, this graph, is supporting a message, the message which is written in the results section. So in this particular case, we have a graph which shows the size of maize seeds, okay, how big they are, how heavy they are, and how much starch they have in them. So it's not about really the quantity of starch or the mass of it's about the general message. Larger seeds have more starch. And everything such as the graph and the statistical analysis supports the message. So when you write the results section of your thesis, of your paper, your manuscript, it should be written in this way. Larger seeds have more starch. It's not about the graph itself. You're supporting a statement. So this is another example. Again, what we should not write is the line on the graph goes up steeply at first and then it becomes flat. It's not about the shapes we can see. It's not about the lines or the dots. Okay. Here, the message is that young people grow very quickly, and when they get to around 20 years old, their height stays more or less the same for the rest of their lives. Okay, so that's the way that you should write it in a scientific document. It's about the message, okay, and not the patterns and the things that you can see moving around on the graph. So that's the way that you should think about it and the way that you should present it. We're not interested in the curves or the points, but in how people grow in this particular instance. Just a few more details about how results should be presented in a document. The first thing is that the text that's written is describing the data. They're the messages that are supported by the data, and it shouldn't be about anything else. There should be no citations to other work, to other additional data. It's all a description of what's here in this study. In this particular figure, then, there are some values, some data points, which should only really be the most important data points. It's not a list of all the data that's shown in the graph. we shouldn't be repeating things. The graph shows all sorts of differences and details, but what we should report in the text is the main difference. This particular thing is higher, and that's what we want to put emphasis on in our message and the values that we show in the text. So whenever we make a statement, whenever we present a data value, it should always be linked with the particular figure. Also because you could have several figures and you need to be very clear about which one is supporting your statement. So the text has no interpretation in the results section. You're writing your master's thesis and you write about what's shown in the figure, and there's a temptation to interpret that straight away. But this is incorrect. The interpretation should come in the discussion section. So in this particular example, figure 1 shows that X is greater than Y. That's correct because it's describing the data. That's all. It's just simply describing. But all of these words indicate interpretation. Because this means that, probably due to, and this is wrong in the results section, because you're starting to interpret, no, the results is simply a description. Tables are a very particular form of presenting information. The thing about tables is that they're very bad at instantly communicating a message. Graphs are good for that. Okay, a line, points, they show things really straight away. What tables are good at is making the data, the numbers, available. Very often now there's a trend to put the tables into a separate appendix at the bottom of a document, or as supplementary additional information on a website when you publish a document. But some tables are absolutely essential because they have the main data of the study, or that data is simply too valuable or too useful. Or maybe in this particular case, the table is being used also to show the experimental setup. Okay, the tables are not just about results, but also in defining, in this particular case, defining different fields, soil characteristics, where an experiment was carried out, where it took place. So a table can go in the methods section, but only if it's really, really necessary. Just as a little detail, an important detail, the legend of a table goes above. We saw for a figure that the legend of the figure goes below the figure, a table legend goes above. You shouldn't make this up. You shouldn't invent your own system, because the whole world uses this convention that a table legend goes above and a figure legend below. There are only a few exceptions to this rule. Now, we've seen that the results section is about describing the results. The discussion is speculation, it's more interpretation, but this is the important thing. It starts from your results and your hypothesis. Everything should come back to the main research objective. So a good discussion is written with a statement like, the data indicate that. It's talking very specifically about the results here, about your results. The data indicate, we demonstrated, and eventually the discussion will go on to put that interpretation into the wider context of other people's work. For example, it should come back to the hypothesis. The results support the hypothesis. It should directly address the hypothesis. After that, then we can put in references to other work. We can put in more speculation. It becomes more general, representing the hourglass structure. Okay, the end of the discussion widens out, becomes more speculative, and this is how you should be thinking about the structure of your document. At the end of a discussion, or as a separate section, there is usually a conclusion, which is one paragraph, okay, one paragraph. And this is like an abstract, it's like a summary, but a summary or abstract will summarize the whole document. the introduction, the methods, results, discussion. In this particular case, it's mainly summarizing the results and the main interpretation, the main message. Okay, it's just to put emphasis on it and to underline all of the discussion, how it comes to one point. So that's about document structure, about understanding document structure when you write. What I want to talk about now is the third skill for good scientific writing, and this is the ability to summarize or the ability to précis. Okay, the art of summarizing. This is perhaps one of the most important skills that I learned when I started writing. When I was writing scientific documents, my PhD thesis, for example, I was actually taught this method by my PhD supervisor, and it's the most useful method that I've used in everything that I've done. And I think if you can do this well, it sets you apart from other people, and it really helps to get your work communicated and published. So précis is actually two things. The traditional classic view of précis is to summarize somebody else's document, somebody else's work. In this particular example that I used before, Wordsworth's poem, a précis is me explaining what Wordsworth was saying in a concise way, but without losing the meaning, the main message. So in this particular example of a traditional précis, I would say, as Wordsworth walked through the countryside, he was suddenly struck by the beauty of a group of daffodils. Now it says the main message that Wordsworth wanted to convey, maybe without the poetry, without the emotions, but the point is to make it more compact and concise without losing the main message. But again, it's a traditional précis of somebody else's work. When it comes to scientific writing, it's about taking your own work and condensing it and summarizing it without losing the meaning. In this particular example, what I did before, I was walking alone when I suddenly saw 153 plants. This is a different kind of précis. It's a scientific précis. It's condensing and maintaining the general meaning and the knowledge and doing it in a very limited space. So this is the kind of trick that you have to learn. It's not just about switching off the emotive language, but also learning how to convey basically the same message in a very concise amount of text. For example, Wordsworth used 39 words and 200 characters, including spaces, always including spaces, and my version with 18 words and 111 characters, including spaces. My version is different. It's a different thing. It has a different aim. Okay, mine has fewer characters, but it's communicating knowledge and not the emotion. It's very concise and precise, but it's also very boring. So it has a different reason, a different concept behind it. This is an example which I've taken from another Webster's book, Webster's New World Student Writing Handbook. This particular paragraph, which we're not going to read in its whole entirety, this particular paragraph is talking about the importance of birds in agriculture because they can eat pest insects and the kind of activities that farmers can do to encourage birds in their fields. What I've just done vocally is to summarize this. I've done a vocal précis, but the actual précis from the book is this. And what they've done here is to condense all of that into just 53 words, but getting those main messages into it. Okay, birds, because they have a high metabolic rate, will eat a lot, and they eat a lot of insects, and we can encourage that by putting particular vegetation, particular habitats into our areas. So this is a way of précis and scientific summarizing. In this particular case, 11 sentences are condensed into just 3. The details maybe are missing. So the actual values, the actual numbers are missing. Maybe in your work you want to keep the important numbers and lose a lot of other detail, maybe. But it still has the main message which comes through. So it's a mirror of the main, the original document, the original text, but it's not distorted or changed, and it's essentially the same message that comes through. This is a trick that you can actually learn to do. Let's look at this example. In this example, there are 3 ways of writing the phrase 36%. Okay, I can write it out in full. I can write it as numeric values with the units of measurement, which are in this particular case percent. Sorry, I've lost the laser pointer. Okay, or I can condense it even more. I can take a phrase with 19 characters and get it down to 3 characters. That's a lot when you're talking about the cost of printing a document. That's a lot of ink, but the message is the same. It's precisely the same message. Okay, I'll give you another example. The phrase approximately 2 times smaller. I can write this with symbols and values and different words that mean the same thing. And I have approximately 2 times smaller or approximately 2 times less. This is actually approximately 2 times less characters. It's actually more than 2 times less characters. The message is the same. What's being communicated is the same, but this is a more compact way of doing it. Okay, coming back to our list of skills for scientific writing, the important skills that you should learn for writing, one of the skills was critical editing and listening to advice. So I'm going to teach you some skills, some tricks that I've learned through the years to try and understand how to do this. The main thing is to try and do a very, very strong précis, to get your whole study, your whole document, and express it as one sentence. There are 2 reasons why this is important. Firstly, if you can do that, if you can express it as one message, firstly, you have the title of your document, like that. The other thing is that you can take this title, this message, and keep it in your head as you write the rest of the document. And it will guide you, it will help you. Everything that you have, everything that you write, should come back to this main message. So when you write, you should be asking yourself, is what I'm writing really going back to that message? Is it really helping me to understand that argument? And the other thing is, again, very often you do months of work and you try and put everything in because it's yours and you did it and you want it. But you have to think, is it important for the main message? Is it interesting only to me personally? Or can I cut that out and make it easier to read? So part of this is being prepared to delete entire sections of text, which maybe represent entire months of your working life, because it makes the document easier to read and better at communicating your main message. Okay, so you have to be prepared to cut, to edit. Part of this editing process is listening to advice. In fact, in documents, we have an acknowledgement section in which people that have read your document have given you feedback on it. They've helped you to improve your document. And this is the formal section of a document which will thank these people. It's a way of paying them in a way. But this shows how important it is as a process in scientific writing, that there's even a proper formal section for thanking people for their comments. Very often it's very difficult to listen to advice. It can feel like criticism. It can feel like an attack or something meant to be destructive. It is very difficult to listen to. But you have to understand that very often people have more experience than you, or they have different experience, a different point of view. And what you should do is keep an open mind and try and listen to their message and not say, no, I don't think so. No, I disagree. No, try and listen, try and listen. And if you can understand what they're saying, you might actually have to cut and edit and do this critical editing again. And you should really try and do it at this stage. Because if you're submitting a thesis or you're submitting a document to be published, it's better to correct things at the start than after it's gone public, when it's in the hands of an editor or reviewers and they criticize it and it gets rejected, which can be psychologically very difficult. So it's better to listen to advice and make corrections straight away and understand that that actually might be necessary because people could actually have more experience than you. It's very difficult to do this. Another thing about producing a document is proofreading. So making sure that everything is correct in terms of typography of the words and physically the document itself. Now there's a problem here, and it's related to listening to other people, because an easy way of proofreading is to give it to somebody else and see if they see things that you didn't see. Because when you write a document, there is a phenomenon called reading fatigue. Okay, it becomes difficult to read that document because you've seen it so many times. And more than anything else, when you read the document, your eye tends to expect particular words and it skips over them, and you don't really see what you're writing and what you're reading. So the eye can kind of trick you into thinking that you've written it correctly, but there could be mistakes. So when you read, when you proofread, you have to have a different way of reading. One way of doing this is to read the document from the end towards the start, even though it doesn't make sense in terms of the sentences. The exercise is to check that the words are spelt correctly, that there are no mistakes in the units of measure, in the references to figures, these kind of things. So it's not about reading the message in this particular case, it's about checking the words. Even though there are spell checkers on Word, this is important because some words have different meanings and they're not flagged by the spell checker, they're not evidenced by the spell checker because they have different meanings, but it's not the meaning that you meant or not the right word. So you do have to check it by hand. And reading it backwards or getting somebody else to check it can be very, very important. What I want to talk about in the last part of this lesson is the concept of scientific papers themselves and their importance in science and how to find them, because it's not all about Google, okay, and how to understand if that scientific paper is actually, let's say, good or bad, the kind of quality of it. Again, this is very important because in science we have really high quality science, which is trustworthy, okay? You can put a lot of trust into it. And we have a lot of papers which really aren't all that good and they look important. But then when you look at the information I'm going to show you now, you understand that they're not all that good. So a big part of science is trustworthiness. And the ways that we evaluate this are mainly through something called an impact factor, or IF. Have you ever heard of an impact factor? No, you've never heard of an impact factor. When you get to a level of a doctorate, okay, or when you're working and you're reading scientific technical documents, one of the main things you'll hear all the time is impact factor. What's the impact? This is basically a measure of the importance of a paper, but also how trustworthy it is, how good it is as science. And it's something that everyone talks about. When you become a professional scientist, I published a paper and it had a high impact factor. Wow, okay, cool, that's fantastic. It becomes the main thing, and it's a number. It's this number here, 1.291. That means nothing to you now, okay? It means nothing to you. I understand that. But to a scientist, this is their whole career. To a university, this is their research output. This is a number which evaluates how important the research is. It regulates how visible the research is. It reflects how people are using the work. What it actually is a number that's based on the journal. So for example, if I take this paper, it was published in a journal called Plant, Cell and Environment. That journal will be bought by a library. It will be bought by 1,000 libraries, 1,000,000 libraries. Not only will it be bought by libraries, but the work itself will be cited in documents. It will be used. And if it's used, then it's important. If it's used, then people trust it. The impact factor is a kind of combination of these things. How many people have bought the paper and how many people are using the paper, and it's all condensed into this number. 1.29 is not very high. If I publish a paper which is 3, that's pretty good. If it's 4, I'm very happy. If I read a paper which has an impact of 6, I know that a lot of people have read that and a lot of people trust it. If I read a paper that has an impact of 20, it is the best. Okay, so this gives everyone a kind of common point of reference to understand the trustworthiness of a paper. There's a lot of argument about this because, for example, this journal can be very specialized. It could be the Journal of Coffee Production in Ethiopia. So how many people do you expect to read that? But the information is being communicated to the right audience, to people that produce coffee in Ethiopia. It's communicating to the right audience, and it can be important to that group of people. So a journal can have a low impact factor, but actually be quite important to you, to somebody that reads it or somebody that publishes it. Okay. Based on information like this, we can search for papers, we can try and understand how important they are. One of the ways that you'll search for scientific papers is through Google. Okay, we all do it. Bad habit. There's actually a part of Google which is made for academics, Google Scholar. You're saying that you've used it, that you know about it. Google Scholar, which will give you search results which are based on the scientific literature, so on the scientific documents. And as you can see in red, they will also take you to that document. Okay, I don't care. That's not the system that we use in professional science. There's an older system, a system which will show you only the good science. And by that, I mean peer-reviewed articles. Google will pull everything out. When you look at a scientist on Google, if you look at me on Google Scholar, there is everything there, from a paper that I wrote, which is published in Nature, to a paper discussing some hummingbirds I saw in a tropical forest once, which is not even in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So Google Scholar is a bit too inclusive. It takes everything that has been produced, even the bad stuff, or the stuff which has not been peer-reviewed. But in science, we use a different system. Again, it's based on the library. And here at Milan, we have this system called the University of Milan Library, which you can access at sbaunimi.it, okay, servizi bibliotecario d'Ateneo. And this actually gives us a doorway, an exclusive doorway into the proper scientific system for searching for documents. Okay, you can do this using your login as a student or as a professor of Unimi. And what you do is you go to the Biblioteca Digitale. It takes you to all of the resources that are available to the university. What does this mean? It means that the university, through the library, has paid a subscription, has paid for the access to the good stuff, stuff that's not available through Google. When you go through Google, maybe you'll get to the title and the abstract, but you have to pay $42, always $42 for the paper, okay? We can get access through the university system. I can go through Google and have to pay for my paper on coffee production, and I go through to the same page through the university and I get it. Okay, so in a way, you've paid for it as part of your fees for studying at the university. So in practice, we go to Minerva, and then we get the possibility to search for any database, and the database that you want for science, any realm of science, from hydraulical engineering, botany, viruses, I don't know, flying cows, whatever, anything can be got through Scopus. So you put Scopus into this library search engine, and it will indicate where to go to get it online. So it says, yes, we have Scopus. We have access to Scopus. Click here, Disponibile online. You can get there. You click there, and it actually takes you to a page of information about Scopus, but there is the doorway to get through, the link to the main Scopus page, and that will take you to Scopus itself. This is Scopus. This is the original scientific Google, which only searches peer-reviewed articles. So everything that comes out has been quality control checked by other scientists. Everything that comes out is of good quality. There is no fluff, no opinion. There is no pseudoscience. It is just the science. And this is what professional scientists use. So you can put search terms in, like any search engine, and it will give you a list of titles in particular years. You can filter it. You can apply different filters, author names, years, different authors, for example. But then the really important thing, the really cool thing is this, Trovami. If you click here, it will take you to the document. It'll take you first to a page about the document with the different ways that you can get the document, the different links directly to the document. I'm going to click on the first one, and it's taken me to the main web page on the internet with the option of downloading the PDF. Because I've accessed this through the university system, I have access to the PDF itself. Not always. The university doesn't pay for every scientific journal, but usually you can get the document. In this particular case, I forget the search term that I wrote, but obviously it was something about using e-cigarettes and the fact that they alter your susceptibility to the virus that causes COVID. Okay, but the point is that I can download the PDF file. Okay, when I say that the university has bought this access, it's actually a particular method called subscription. What the university does is that it pays a subscription to an editing house, such as Elsevier or Springer Verlag, or this is Blackwell Publishing, for example, different editing houses which have different journals. And the point is that the library is not subscribing to one journal, it's subscribing to a packet or a group of journals from that publishing house. So you might have access to a whole range of journals, but not everything, from particular publishing houses. It works like that. This is one way that we have access to scientific papers that the general public doesn't have. Okay, this is a very particular advantage that we have with the university, and it's called the subscription method. This is the traditional method of getting scientific journals. Okay, but it's not the only method. Nowadays, there's a lot of emphasis on open access. Maybe you've heard of open access, which is basically where it's not the library or the university that pays, but the author, the person that produced the document. Usually, for example, if I write a paper, I write a manuscript and I send it, they will ask me for $2,000, 3,000 Swiss francs, usually Swiss francs. Interestingly, it's usually francs or dollars. Okay, sometimes in euros, but you know, good stuff. Some not in gold, but I can imagine that they would ask in gold because they know that you're paid as part of projects, and projects usually have a lot of money, so they ask a huge amount of money just to put a document on a website. This is called open access publishing. This can actually be quite good from one point of view, which means that anyone can access it and read it. If you're a funding body, somebody that's paid for the work, and the work is published open access, then you know that your money has been used and will be communicated to everyone. So it's a good thing from the point of view of getting money. If you write a project and you want to say, I will communicate the results of my work, it's a good thing to say, I will communicate it through an open access journal, because then they know that everyone will have access to it. The bad thing is that you pay, or you, more correctly, your project pays for that. But actually, I'll share a little truth with you. This is the traditional way of doing it. When Alexander von Humboldt came back from South America, he wasn't paid for his book. He paid to have his book published. Charles Darwin on The Origin of Species, he paid John Murray, the publishing house in London, to publish his book. And then, as with any book, there's money that comes back. It's a business. But traditionally, it was the author that had to come up with the initial money to publish the document. This is one of the reasons why scientists were gentlemen, because they had time, they didn't have any work to do, and they had lots of money, so they could put this kind of seed capital, this initial money, to get the book published. And then if they were lucky, they would get some money back. So this is actually really the traditional way of doing it. Okay, with one way of doing it is to buy the single paper. So you can go on Google and they'll say $42, $30, $50 for the paper. Okay, I've never done that myself. I've never heard of anybody actually paying for a single document. Also because when you're a professional scientist, you know that it's really, really stupid to do that, because we have another way of doing it, because we talk to each other. Okay, we know who wrote the paper, we know their address, we have their email and their telephone number. We ask and we get. This is the way that we actually do it. When you become a professional scientist, or you work for a firm that uses science, what you do is this better way, a free way. It's absolutely free. You just write. You're part of a scientific community. Okay, when we talk about peers, it's not just about criticizing each other, it's also about supporting each other. When a reviewer or an editor criticizes a scientific paper, the aim is to improve it. It's not to destroy it, it's to improve it. And one of the other things that we can do is simply to communicate with each other directly, and we can write and ask for papers. We can usually you write for an off-print request. This is a very particular thing, an off-print request. When I started this lesson, I said that scientific papers are printed in issues, which are then combined in volumes and put into the library. When those issues are printed, they print the individual paper and they have some extras left over. So they're printed precisely in the way that appears in the journal, on the same paper and everything, but they're extra, they're prints that are off the main production, okay? And that is literally what I have here. It is an off print from the main production of this paper. So it's the original physical paper that was used in the journal itself. This is an off print. Nowadays, an off print can be the PDF file electronically, but also when somebody prints it off themselves. But we have this tradition now in science to ask for an off print. So you write a letter saying, very simple, in the title you put off print request, and you say, I'm really interested in your work. Can you send me an off print of this paper with a citation? Many thanks, and your name. A very simple thing. And they always reply, and they always send you the paper. They send you extra things that maybe you're interested in, and it's all free. And as part of the scientific community, you have this power. The other thing that we can do to share, to make this sharing much more efficient, is a particular website which we all know about, called ResearchGate. ResearchGate, portale gate, okay, a point of access for research, is where everyone has their own kind of Facebook page, but with a list of all of their papers, and you can actually get the papers from there, for many of them. Okay, not all of them, but you can actually download the PDF files. So if you can't find it through Google Scholar, you can't get it through a subscription service through the library, they don't reply to you when you write an email, go to ResearchGate, and very often you'll find the PDF for free. The other thing is, there is a particular problem with copyright laws. When a paper is published, it becomes the copyright of the publishing house. So I wrote this paper, but it's not mine anymore. It now belongs to Blackwell Publishing. If I put that PDF file on the internet, on ResearchGate or the university website, I am stealing Blackwell's thing. It's not mine anymore. But I wrote a document, a manuscript, which was submitted to create this, and that is mine. Before it was corrected, but it has the same stuff in it. It has the same graphs, the same information. I can put that on ResearchGate. I can put that on the university system for storing documents. So if you can't find a PDF file of the actual document, very often you can find the original manuscript. So there are various ways of finding papers or the information that's in papers.